Chapter 4 Nephilim in the Promised Land. This book is about the gospel and how it applies to hybrids, particularly Nephilim. Because of this, I will spend the next few chapters addressing doctrines which say that Nephilim have no chance of mercy. Central to most of these doctrines is the belief that the Canaanite tribes inhabiting the Promised Land were Nephilim, and that is why God judged them. What I used to believe. In my first book, I explained why I, and many others, believe that God destroyed not just humans, but all living creatures with Noah's flood. That is, as well as the widespread wickedness, there were Nephilim on the earth, and such wide-scale genetic corruption of creation that God effectively wanted to start again. Because God judged the entire world, including pre-flood Nephilim, some believe that he hates and destroys Nephilim. That belief, coupled with the understanding that God judged Canaanite tribes in the Promised Land because there were Nephilim, leads to the belief that all Nephilim are destined to be destroyed without mercy. You may hear that belief expressed something like this: the tribes in the Promised Land were all Nephilim. That's why God ordered their destruction. When we began hearing testimonies concerning Nephilim, I researched Scripture to see if what I was hearing was even possible. My initial studies led me to believe that the Canaanite tribes were Nephilim giants. Numbers 13:33. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. For the Israelites who saw Nephilim, seeing themselves as grasshoppers and understanding that's how they looked to them, indicates that the Nephilim were giants. In my understanding at the time, Nephilim equaled giant. We'll look shortly at scriptures which support the idea that the Canaanite tribes were giants, but we need to clarify what the spies saw. Nephilim or descendants of the Nephilim? Numbers 13:33. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. When the Israelite spies saw the Nephilim, it is unclear whether they saw Nephilim or descendants of Nephilim. When the Hebrew is looked at closely, the first mention of Nephilim has an extra mark, Yod. It was pointed out to me by Pastor Doug Riggs that in his understanding, this mark changes the meanings of the word to descendants of Nephilim, and the verse becomes clear. If Doug is correct, this clarifies what is being said. We saw the Nephilim. Extra punctuation, Doug says, this means descendants of Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. This second mention of Nephilim is exactly the same as used in Genesis 6, where it refers to a first-generation Nephilim. Doug Riggs says this word is used in Genesis 6 and Numbers 13:33, referring to the first-generation Nephilim. Doug says this variation of the word used in Numbers 13:33 means descended from Nephilim. If this is the case, we can read this verse thus: we saw the descendants of Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from first-generation Nephilim. I do not know Hebrew, and I am dependent on the work of others, Pastor Doug Riggs in this case, but this explanation, if correct, makes the verse clear. Even if this is not the case, this scripture would seem to make it clear that the descendants of Anak were not first-generation Nephilim. They were descendants. It seems that the word Nephilim, as it's used today, makes no distinction as to whether it's referring to first-generation Nephilim, the son of a fallen angel, the descendants of Nephilim, or a hybrid which contains the Nephilim genes. I usually use the word Nephilim in the same way, which is to broadly include anyone with a high percentage of Nephilim genes. That may mean first-generation Nephilim, a descendant or a genetically engineered being with Nephilim genes. It seems the prevailing use of the word, amongst those who believe that Nephilim were in the Promised Land, is to include the first-generation offspring of fallen angels. Nephilim and descendants of Nephilim under the one heading of Nephilim, and for some, this seems to include all the Canaanite tribes. So when Moses told the Israelites they would dispossess the sons of Anak, he was not telling them that they would dispossess Nephilim, but the descendants of Nephilim, the descendants of Anak. Similarly, it would seem that the mysterious Rephaim, who many consider to be Nephilim, were extinct apart from King Og, who was killed by Moses. Og is described as the last of the Rephites. If Og is the last and he was killed, then from that point on, Scripture can only be referring to, at best, the descendants of the Rephaim. The NIV refers to the Philistine giants, of whom Goliath was just one, as coming from the giant, Rapha. It appears that just as there was a giant named Anak, from whom came the sons of Anak, there may have been a giant, Rapha, from whom came Goliath and his brothers. It is possible that there were descendants of Anak who survived Joshua's campaigns. Either way, at best, the Philistine giants were descendants of Rephaim, or descendants of Anak. They were not first-generation Nephilim. Possibly, when the Israelites crossed the Jordan, there were no first-generation Nephilim in the Promised Land, only descendants of Nephilim. In my thinking, a descendant of Nephilim is not Nephilim. At best, they are part Nephilim. If you believe that God judges Nephilim without mercy, then this raises a question that is impossible to answer. If someone is a descendant of Nephilim, then how much Nephilim blood do they have to have in order to be rejected by God? I discuss the futility of this question later. Either way, I believed the Canaanite tribes were Nephilim giants. Scriptures that seem to support Canaanites equal Nephilim equal giants. Deuteronomy 9, 1-2. Hear, O Yisrael, you are to cross over the Jordan today and go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than yourself, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim, whom you know and whom you've heard it said, who can stand before the descendants of Anak? The way that the NIV and the NLT translate the verse makes it seem so clear. Deuteronomy 9, 1-2. Hear, O Yisrael, you are now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people are strong and tall, Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites? Deuteronomy 9, 1-2, the New Living Translation. Listen, O Israel, today you are about to cross the Jordan River to take over the land belonging to nations much greater and more powerful than you. They live in cities with walls that reach to the sky. The people are strong and tall, descendants of the famous Anakite giants. You've heard the saying, who can stand up to the Anakites? To me, at the time, it was reasonable that this passage, Deuteronomy 9, 1-2, was telling the Israelites that all the nations in the Promised Land were greater and mightier than them, were giants, lived in great fortified cities, were the descendants of Anak, and therefore were all Nephilim. It would seem that fallen angels had been having sexual intercourse with human women, as had been happening before the flood, and God wanted the resultant Nephilim giants in the Promised Land destroyed. Since he had promised that the earth would never again be destroyed by a flood, his command to the Israelites to destroy Nephilim would achieve the same result. A scripture in Amos seemed to reinforce their size. Amos 2:9. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was as strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath. When I came to these conclusions in the light of contemporary testimonies we were hearing, it all made sense. It seemed to me that these conclusions explained God's harsh instructions to destroy the inhabitants of the Promised Land. This understanding seems to be held by those who believe that God judges Nephilim without mercy. However, over time, I became increasingly aware that these conclusions only worked so long as I was selective with these scriptures I used to support them. When I took into account all of the relevant scriptures, from Exodus through to Joshua, I could see that there were real anomalies. This led to an in-depth study of Scripture. The spies sent in by Moses reported seeing Nephilim. I felt that the important questions to ask were, which tribes were Nephilim? Along with, what happened to them? I published the results of my study as a separate book, Nephilim in the Promised Land, available as a small book. Here is a summary of what I found. 16 scriptural observations that caused me to question the likelihood that the Canaanite tribes were Nephilim giants. This is a summary of my observations. 1. Jesus Christ is a descendant of Rahab who lived in Jericho. If the inhabitants of Jericho were Nephilim, then Jesus Christ has Nephilim ancestry. I considered that unlikely. Number 2. The Gibeonites tricked Joshua into making a treaty with them when he had been sent by Moses to spy out the promised land. Joshua saw Nephilim giants. Had the Gibeonite emissaries been Nephilim giants, then Joshua would have instantly recognized them and realized the trickery. Number 3. At the end of Joshua's life, the children of Joseph were explaining the reasons why they couldn't drive out the local Canaanites. The reasons were that the Canaanites had iron chariots. Joshua acknowledged that they had iron chariots and also they were strong. But if they were Nephilim giants, it was not mentioned by Joshua or the children of Joseph. Number 4. In the same incident, Joshua suggested that the children of Joseph go and clear the land for themselves in the land of the Perizzites and giants, Rephaim. One land, two peoples. If the Perizzites were the giants, then it would say Perizzite giants. If they weren't giants, then there were not Nephilim separately. Number 5. David had Ahimelech and Uriah, both Hittites, as key people in his army. It appears that at least some Hittites were absorbed into Israel and became practicing observers of the laws of Moses. This would suggest that they were not Nephilim. Number 6. David purchased the area for the temple from Araunah, the Jebusite. There is no indication that he was a giant, and the interaction between them, there was no hint of anything but a business transaction between two men. 7. It appears that some or most of the Jebusites were absorbed into Israel. 8. God deliberately left Canaanite tribes in the land for his purposes. If they were Nephilim, then this would mean that God was putting in place the inevitable corruption of the Israelite bloodline with the Nephilim. A literal interpretation of Amos 2:9 would mean that the Amorites were 130 feet or 40 meters tall, with fir cones on their heads and roots off their legs. It's a metaphoric analogy, as are many other passages of Scripture, not to be taken literally. Number 10. Joshua said that the sons of Anak were removed from the land, and he also said which Canaanite tribes remained in the land. Therefore, if the descendants of Nephilim were removed, then the Canaanite tribes remaining could not possibly be descendants of Nephilim. Number 11. Moses gives the human genealogy of the Canaanite tribes in Genesis 10. Nephilim are not mentioned. Moses also wrote the book of Numbers, where he tells of Nephilim in the Promised Land. The tribes in the Promised Land are not descended from Anak. Number 12. It would seem that Rephaim are also giants. As with the sons of Anak, they were separate and distinct from the Canaanite tribes. Number 13. King Og was a Rephaim giant. He and he alone is described as Rephaim. The people he ruled over were Amorites. The other king east of the Jordan, Sihon, who also ruled over the Amorites, is explicitly described as Amorite. Og was Rephaim. Sihon and the Amorites east of the Jordan were Amorites, not Rephaim. Number 14. If Goliath was descended from Rephaim, then his presence amongst the Philistines does not make the Philistines Rephaim. In the same way, the presence of the sons of Anak does not make the Canaanite tribes Anakim. Taken as a whole, these observations made it seem very unlikely to me that any of the Canaanite tribes were Nephilim. Therefore, I had to look closely at scriptures which I had previously understood as saying that they were. I was amazed at what I had failed to see before, but had been there all along. Number 15. When the spies gave their report and told of the Nephilim giants, they actually reported the sons of Anak as being separate and distinct from the people of the land, the Canaanite tribes. Number 16. When Moses described the people of the land, Deuteronomy 9:2, he again made a distinction between the giants, the sons of Anak, and the people of the land, the Canaanite tribes. Scriptural observations 1 through 14 made it seem unlikely that any of the tribes in the Promised Land were Nephilim. These observations, along with the realization that Moses had differentiated between the people of the land and the Nephilim giants, for me ruled conclusively that the only people who were Nephilim in the Promised Land or descended from Nephilim were the descendants of Anak. Therefore, the doctrine that God judged the tribes in the Promised Land because they were Nephilim cannot be correct. If this is incorrect, then to argue that God judges Nephilim without mercy because of the example of judgment of the tribes in the Promised Land is also incorrect. What I now believe, the scriptural arguments I had used to show that the Canaanite tribes were Nephilim weakened or failed completely under examination. I now stick to what Scripture says clearly, which is that the judgment against the Canaanites was for their wickedness, and that their continued presence among the Israelites would lead to apostasy. God's judgment was that they be eradicated, and was because of their wickedness, not their ethnicity. Some readers will want to look closely at the details supporting these conclusions. I have made the study available as a separate book, Nephilim in the Promised Land, available in paperback or Kindle versions on Amazon.com.